Well, happy Friday. We're here for another shared experience. Now, this is something I've got to tell you. I'm going to be doing something from Toni Morrison. And my intimate relationship with Toni started here at Story and Song. A year ago, I bought this, which is The Source of Self-Regard, Selected Essays, Speeches, and Meditations by Toni Morrison. It was published just after she passed. And I took this on vacation with me, and I read it in a state of utter ecstasy. Now, Donna just informed me, I wish I'd seen this first, a paperback version, which is much less expensive than the other. But Donna has both versions here at the store. Now, lest you think, oh, I'm just having a little case of personal prejudice, I want you to be aware of something. Not planned. This morning, I go to my computer. I've got this Delancey Place thing on my computer that sends me something every day, literally 7 days a week. And the submission, it's usually a very short section from a nonfiction piece, was from, surprise, The Source of Self-Regard, Toni Morrison. And I'm just going to read you the one paragraph that I greeted the day with. And then I'm going to read something else from here. During the years of dictatorship in Haiti, and this is from a section called The Habit of Art, the government gangs, known as the Tanto Macutes, roamed about the island, killing dissenters and ordinary and innocent people at their leisure. Not content with the slaughter of one person for whatever reason, they instituted an especially cruel follow-through. No one was allowed to retrieve the dead lying in the streets or parks or in the doorways. If a brother or parent or child, even a neighbor, ventured out to do so, to bury the dead, honor him or her, they were themselves shot and killed. The bodies lay where they fell until a government garbage truck arrived to dispose of the corpses, emphasizing that relationship between a disposed of human and trash. You can imagine the horror, the devastation, the trauma this practice had on the citizens. Then, one day, a local teacher gathered some people in a neighborhood to join him in a garage and put on a play. Each night, they repeated the same performance. When they were observed by a gang member, the killer only saw some harmless people engaged in some harmless theatrics. But the play they were performing was Antigone, that ancient Greek tragedy about the moral and fatal consequences of dishonoring the unburied dead. Toni Morrison weaves art into life. And now, I've got so many favorites I've lost count. Excuse me, another favorite. Invisible ink, reading the writing and writing the reading. I once wrote an article for a popular magazine that had a small, irregular arts section. They wanted something laudatory about the value, or perhaps just the pleasure, of reading. This last noun, pleasure, annoyed me because it is routinely associated with emotion, delight accompanied by suspense. Reading is fundamental. Emphasis on the fun. At the least, of course, it is understood in popular discourse to be uplifting, instructive, at its best, encouraging deep thought. Thoughts about the practice of reading engaged me early on as a writer-imaginer as well as an absorbent reader. I began reading when I was 3 years old, but it was always difficult for me. Not difficult as in hard to do, but difficult in the sense of having a hard time looking for meaning in and beyond the words. The first grade primer sentence, "Run, Jip, run," led me to the question, why is he running? Is that a command? If so, where to? Is the dog being chased? Or is it chasing someone? Later on, when I tackled Hansel and Gretel, more serious questions flooded, as they did with nursery rhymes and games. Ring around the rosy pocketful of posies. It was some time before I understood that the rhyme, the game, was about death during the bubonic plague. So I chose for this magazine an attempt to distinguish reading as a skill and reading as an art. This is some of what I wrote. Mr. Head awakened to discover that the room was full of moonlight. He sat up, stared at the floorboards, the color of silver, and then at the ticking on his pillow, which might have been brocade. And after a second, he saw half of the moon 5 feet away in his shaving mirror, paused as if it were waiting for his permission to enter. It rolled forward and cast a dignifying light on everything. The straight chair against the wall looked stiff and attentive, as if it were waiting an order. And Mr. Head's trousers, hanging on the back of it, had an almost noble air, like the garment of some great man had just flung to his servant. In those opening sentences by Flannery O'Connor, she chose to direct her reader to Mr. Head's fantasies, his hopes. The ticking on a pillow, minus a pillow slip, is like brocade, rich, elaborate. Moonlight turns a wooden floor to silver and casts a dignifying light everywhere. His chair is stiff and attentive and seems to await an order from him. Even his trousers, hanging on the chair's back, had a noble air, like the garment of some great man had flung to his servant. So, Mr. Head has strong, perhaps unmanageable dreams of majesty, of controlling servants to do his bidding, of rightful authority. Even the moon in his shaving mirror pauses as if it were waiting for his permission to enter. We don't really have to wait a few sentences on to see his alarm clock sitting on an overturned bucket, or to wonder why his shaving mirror is 5 feet away from his bed, to know a great deal about him, his pretensions, his insecurity, his pathetic yearnings, and to anticipate his behavior as the story unfolds. In my essay, I was trying to identify characteristics of flawless writing that made it possible to read fiction again and again, to step into its world, confident that attentiveness will always yield wonder. How to make the work work while it makes me do the same. I thought my illustration was fine as far as it went, but what I could not clearly articulate was the way in which the reader participates in the text. Oh, no, not how she interprets it, but how she helps to write it. Oh, very like singing. You know, there are the lyrics, the score, and then the performance, which is the individual's contribution to the piece. Invisible ink is what lies under, between, and outside the lines, hidden until the right reader discovers it. By right reader, I'm suggesting that certain books are obviously not for every reader. It's possible to admire but not become emotionally or intellectually involved in Proust. Even a reader who loves the book may not be the best or right lover. The reader who is made for the book is the one attuned to the invisible ink. The usual dyad in literary criticism is the stable text versus the actualized reader. The reader and his readings can change, but the text does not. It is stable. As the text cannot change, it follows that a successful relationship between text and reader can only come about through changes in the reader's projections. It seems to me the question becomes whether those dormant projections are products of the reader or of the writer. What I want to suggest is that may not always be so. While the responsibility of interpretation is understood to be transferred to the reader, the text is not always a quiet patient the reader brings to life. I want to introduce a third party into the equation: the author. Some writers of fiction design their text to disturb, not merely with suspenseful plots, provocative themes, interesting characters, or even mayhem. They design their fiction to disturb, rattle, and engage the entire environment of the reading experience. Withdrawing metaphor and simile is just as important as choosing them. Leading sentences can be written to contain buried information that completes, invades, or manipulates the reading. The unwritten is as significant as the written, and the gaps that are deliberate and deliberately seductive, when filled by the right reader, produce the text in its entirety and attest to its living life. Think of Benito Cereno in this regard, where the author chooses the narrator's point of view to deliberately manipulate the reading experience. There are certain assumptions about categories that are regularly employed to arouse this disturbance. I would like to see a book written where the gender of the narrator is unspecified, unmentioned. Gender, like race, carries with it a panoply of certainties, all deployed by the writer to elicit certain responses and perhaps to defy others. Race, as the O'Connor, Coetzee, Melville examples show, contains and produces more certainties. I've written elsewhere about the metaphorical use to which racial codes are put, sometimes to clarify, sometimes to solidify assumptions readers may hold. Virginia Woolf with her gaps. Faulkner with his delays both control the reader and lead her to operate within the text. But it is true that the text does not formulate expectations or their modification, or that such formulation is the province of the reader. enabling the text to be translated and transferred to his own mind. Oh, I admit to this deliberate deployment in almost all of my own books. Overt demands that the reader not just participate in the narrative, but specifically to help write it, sometimes with a question. Who dies at the end of Song of Solomon? And does it matter? You know, sometimes with a calculated withholding of gender. Who is the opening speaker in Love? Is it a woman or a man who says, "Women spread their legs wide open and hum," or in jazz? Is it a man or a woman who declares, "I love this city"? For the not right reader, such strategies are annoying, like a withholding of butter from toast. For others, it is a gate partially open and begging for entrance. I am not alone in focusing on race as a non-signifier. Ron Kurtz has done this rather expertly in Life and Times of Michael Kay. In that book, we make instant assumptions based on the fact that the place is South Africa. The character is a poor laborer, sometimes itinerant. The people tend to shy away from him. But he has a severe hair lap that may be the reason for his bad luck. Nowhere in the book is Michael's race mentioned. As readers, we make the assumption, or we don't. What if we read the invisible ink in the book and found it to be otherwise, as the trials of a poor white Southern African, of which there are legion, clearly? The opening sentence of Paradise is a blatant example of invisible ink. They shot the white girl first and took their time with the rest. How much will the reader's imagination be occupied with sorting out who is the white girl? When will the reader believe she has spotted her? When will it be clear that while having the information is vital to the town's vigilantes, does it really matter to the reader? If so, whatever the choice is made, it is the reader I force into help writing the book. It is the reader whom I summon in invisible ink, destabilizing the text and reorienting the reader. From Are You Afraid?, the opening sentence of A Mercy, calming the reader, swearing to do no harm, to the penultimate chapters, Are You Afraid? You should be. Writing the reading involves seduction, luring the reader into environments outside the pages, disqualifying the notion of a stable text for one that is dependent on an active and activated reader who is writing the reading in invisible ink. Let me close with some words from a book that I believe is a further example. They rose up like men. We saw them like men. They stood. Oh, you have so many adventures in this book, or the paperback edition thereof. Now, bear with me just a little while longer. I have a new best friend. a book I discovered less than a week ago, Talking to Strangers by Paul Auster. And I'm going to get Connor to take some pictures in the book eventually. I could just throw this book open. I never throw books. And any page it opens to, it would be a page worth reading. Ah, I love this. The Story of My Typewriter, with paintings by Sam Messer. Three and a half years later, I came home to America. It was July 1974, and when I unpacked my bags that first afternoon in New York, I discovered that my little Hermes typewriter had been destroyed. The cover was smashed in. The keys were mangled and twisted out of shape, and there was no hope of it ever being repaired. Now, I couldn't afford to buy a new typewriter. I rarely had much money in those days, but at that particular moment, I was dead broke. A couple of nights later, an old college friend invited me to his apartment for dinner. At some point during our conversation, I mentioned what had happened to my typewriter, and he told me that he had one in the closet that he didn't use anymore. Oh, it had been given to him as a graduation present from junior high school in 1962. If I wanted to buy it from him, he said, he would gladly sell it to me. We agreed on a price of $40. Oh, it was an Olympia portable, manufactured in West Germany. Now, that country no longer exists, but since that day in 1974, every word I have written has been typed on that machine. In the beginning, I didn't think about it much. A year went by, 10 years went by, and not once did I consider it odd or even vaguely unusual to be working with a manual typewriter. The only alternative was an electric typewriter, but I didn't like the noise those contraptions made. The constant hum of the motor, the buzzing and rattling of loose parts, the jittering pulse of alternating current vibrating in my fingers. I preferred the stillness of my Olympia. It was comfortable to the touch. It worked smoothly. It was dependable. And when I wasn't pounding on the keyboard, it was silent. Best of all, it seemed to be indestructible. Except for changing the ribbons and occasionally having to brush out the ink buildup from the keys, I was absolved of all maintenance duties. Since 1974, I've changed the roller twice, perhaps 3 times. I've taken it into the shop for cleaning, no more often than I have voted in presidential elections. I have never had to replace any parts. The only serious trauma it has suffered occurred in 1979, when my 2-year-old son snapped off the carriage return arm. But that was not the typewriter's fault. I was in despair for the rest of the day. But the next morning, I carried it to the shop on Court Street and had the arm soldered back in place. There was a small scar on that spot now, but the operation was a success, and the arm has held ever since. There's no point talking about computers and word processors. Early on, I was tempted to buy one of those marvels for myself, But too many friends told me horror stories about pushing the wrong button and wiping out a day's work or a month's work. And I heard one too many warnings about sudden power failures that could erase an entire manuscript in less than half a second. I have never been good with machines, and I knew that if there was a wrong button to be pushed, I would eventually push it. So, I held on to my old typewriter, and the 1980s became the 1990s. One by one, all my friends switched over to Macs and IBMs. I began to look like an enemy of progress, the last pagan holdout in a world of digital converts. My friends made fun of me for resisting the new ways. When they weren't calling me a curmudgeon, they called me a reactionary, and a stubborn old goat. I didn't care. What was good for them wasn't necessarily good for me, I said. Why should I change when I was perfectly happy as I was? Until then, I hadn't felt particularly attached to my typewriter. It was simply a tool that allowed me to do my work. But now that it had become an endangered species, one of the last surviving artifacts of 20th century Homo scriptoris, I began to develop a certain affection for it. Like it or not, I realized we had the same past. As time went on, I came to understand that we also had the same future. 2 or 3 years ago, sensing that the end was near, I went to Leon, my local stationer in Brooklyn, and asked him to order 50 typewriter ribbons for me. He had to call around for several days to scare up an order of that size. Some of them, he later told me, were shipped in from as far away as Kansas City. I use these ribbons as cautiously as I can, typing them until the ink is all but invisible on the page. When the supply is gone, I have little hope that there will be any ribbons left. It's never my intention to turn my typewriter into a heroic figure. That is the work of Sam Messner, a man who stepped into my house one day and fell in love with the machine. There's no counting for the passions of artists. The affair has lasted for several years now, and right from the beginning, I suspect that the feelings have been mutual. Messer seldom goes anywhere without a sketchbook. He draws constantly, stabbing at the page with furious, rapid strokes, looking up from his pad every other second to squint at the person or the object before him, and whenever you sit down to a meal with him, you do so with the understanding that you are also posing for a portrait. We've been through this routine so many times in the past 7 or 8 years that I no longer think about it. I remember pointing out the typewriter to him the first time he visited, but I can't remember what he said. A day or two after that, he came back to the house. I wasn't around that afternoon, but he asked my wife if he could go downstairs to my workroom and have another look at the typewriter. God knows what he did down there, but I have never doubted that the typewriter spoke to him. In due course, I believe, he even managed to persuade it to bare his soul. He's been back several times since, and each visit has produced a fresh wave of paintings, drawings, and photographs. Sam has taken possession of my typewriter, and little by little he has turned an inanimate object into a being with a personality and a presence in the world. The typewriter has moods and desires now. It expresses dark angers and exuberant joys, and trapped within its gray, metallic body, you would almost swear that you could hear the beating of a heart. I have to admit that I find all this unsettling. Oh, the paintings are brilliantly done, and I am proud of my typewriter for proving to be such a worthy subject. But at the same time, Messer has forced me to look at my old companion in a new way. I'm still in the process of adjustment, but whenever I look at one of these paintings now, oh, there are two of them hanging on my living room wall, I have trouble thinking of my typewriter as an it. Slowly but surely, it has turned into him. We have been together for more than a quarter of a century now. Everywhere I've gone, the typewriter has gone with me. We lived in Manhattan, in upstate New York, and in Brooklyn. We have traveled together to California and to Maine, to Minnesota and Massachusetts, to Vermont and to France. In that time, I've written with hundreds of pencils and pens. I've owned several cars, several refrigerators, and have occupied several apartments and houses. I've worn out dozens of pairs of shoes, have given up on scores of sweaters and jackets, have lost or abandoned watches, alarm clocks, and umbrellas. Everything breaks, everything wears out, everything loses its purpose in the end. But the typewriter is still with me. It's the only object I own today that I owned 26 years ago. In another few months, it will have been with me for exactly half my life. And now, Connor, I want to share some of Messer's paintings of him, the typewriter. Tell me when you want to turn. Look at that one. One of my all-time favorites. Check out the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. And thus endeth today's journey. We will be back on Wednesday with some poetry. Thank you for coming by today. And stop by the store and pick up these books. They're an enticement. Thank you for coming.